Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well and you are up and ready for a new trip to the past. Today I take you to one of the largest and most extravagant castles in the world, a place where for more than a century a brilliant court lived, including famous historical characters such as the Sun King or Queen Marie-Antoinette. And I'm going to tell you about history, of course, but also architecture and decorative arts, and the very particular lifestyle people could have in this court until the French Revolution suddenly put an end to it. As usual, I hope you will find it both relaxing and interesting. And to begin with, before we talk about the castle itself, there is a first question we need to answer, which is why such a large and costly monument was built in the middle of nowhere. Versailles is located about 15 miles southwest of Paris, and there is a city near the castle nowadays, but in the 17th century, when King Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, took the decision to build Versailles, there was almost nothing. The point is that for the kings or the church in the past, impressive architecture and large buildings were never just functional. They were also a mean of communication, in a sense, a way to show the world, to tell what they were, or at least what they wanted to be, how they wanted to be perceived. And maybe this remains true today for the states or large corporations. And Versailles falls very well into that very definition. It was never intended to be primarily a pleasant or beautiful place to live. We will see later that it was probably much less pleasant than you could imagine. But it was, first of all, like a political manifesto by Louis XIV, a way to symbolize and reinforce his power, not only outside France, but maybe even more internally against the French nobility. And to understand this, we need to go back even further in the past and spend a few minutes on the history of the French monarchy. In the Middle Age, several centuries before the building of Versailles, France, together with England, was the archetypal feudal kingdom. And this means that the organization of the kingdom was like a pyramid with the king at the top and the nobility just below, with the highest nobles, the most powerful noble families, pledging allegiance to the king and directly controlling the administration of their land. But sometimes, even though they were technically below the king, some noble families could be more powerful than he was, because they were wealthier or they controlled larger armies, and they were a constant threat to the reality of the royal power in France. Actually, starting in the 10th and 11th centuries, the territory that belonged directly to the king was just a tiny part of the French kingdom centered around Paris, and bit by bit, generation after generation, the French kings tried to enlarge this territory that they controlled directly to reinforce the centralization of the kingdom in order to check the power of the nobility. This was an extremely long process that lasted for centuries, as I said, with periods of reinforcement of royal power. For example, in the 13th century, with powerful kings like Saint Louis IX. He was the king whose name was given to the city of St. Louis, Missouri, centuries later when it was founded, or Philip IV, also known as Philip August, the king who ordered the destruction of the Order of the Knights Templar. I talked about that in the related video. And also periods of weakening of royal power, like during the 100 Years' War, for example, when vassals of the French king, like the Dukes of Burgundy, allied with the English. But century after century, this policy of reinforcing the central power of the king and progressively centralizing France gave results, making France an increasingly centralized kingdom. But in the 17th century, all tension had not disappeared yet, and especially after the reign of Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII, and his famous prime minister, Richelieu. Richelieu is generally well known for being the fictional villain in the Three Musketeers novel and movies, because Richelieu conducted a policy of reinforced centralization at the expense of the nobility, and when Louis XIV was still a child, when he was 4, his father died, and taking advantage of a temporary weakening of royal power, because there was no adult king, a part of the high nobility revolted militarily at the beginning of the 1650s. Even though this revolt was finally reduced, controlled, it had a strong impact on Louis XIV's priorities, because he understood that he needed to control, to keep in check the nobility if he wanted to ensure the reality of his power. And that's the first reason to be of the Castle of Versailles. Versailles is a war machine against the French high nobility, because Louis XIV built this castle to force the nobles to live at the court, the royal French court. Before, the building of Versailles was a relatively small group of people, and Versailles was made big enough to receive the entirety of the French high nobility, and Louis XIV, from the beginning of his effective ruling of France, would force all the nobles to spend at least half of their time living like courtiers in Versailles. Having them living close to him was very advantageous for the king, because it meant that they would be more obsessed with life at court and not on their land, with the temptation to raise their own armies or reinforce their control of their own domains. I insisted quite a lot on this long story of increased centralization in France, because I think this is crucial if you want to understand some aspects of the French political culture, and especially the importance given to the state. In many countries, and the US are a good example of that, there is the perception that a nation pre-existed the state. If I take this American example, there is the perception that there was a community of interest, a community of destiny, and that the federal government was created to organize the life of this nation. In the case of France, it almost worked the other way around. It is a state with kings for centuries, and later a republic that has been conducting a policy of creating a country, of creating a nation, by progressively centralizing, integrating regions that had initially very little in common, and this continues to have plenty of consequences in France today. For example, France is a highly centralized country. The possibility that the law or the education system could be different from one region to another, like in a federal state, is completely alien to the French political culture. The regional identities are also much weaker in France than in European countries of a similar size and population. When you compare France with Spain, Germany, Italy, or the UK, you see that the accents, the regional accents on the French territory are much lighter than in these countries. You see that there are very little regionalist movements that claim for more autonomy or independence. They exist in some regions that have maintained a bit more of local identity, like Brittany or Alsace or Corsica, but these movements are extremely weak politically in comparison with what they can be in other European countries. And finally, for the better or the worse, the importance of the state in the French political tradition is probably much higher than in other countries, because there is a bit of confusion historically, or for historical reasons, between the French nation and the French state, given that it is the state that created this nation, and that the distinction therefore becomes a little bit unclear. But now, returning to my story about Versailles, you understand that the primary goal, the main reason to be of this castle was to reinforce, to ensure that the power of the king would not be threatened internally by the nobles. And there were also an external dimension, a diplomatic dimension to the building of Versailles. And here we need to talk about the rise of France in the 17th century as the leading great power in Europe. In the history of France, there were two periods when France was the most powerful country in Europe. Maybe the first period in the 13th century, when the unification of the kingdom, period of relative prosperity and various conquests by the French kings, made the Kingdom of France appear as the most powerful and most populated country in Europe. But after that, in the 14th and 15th centuries, came the Hundred Years' War against England, epidemics, at a later stage in the 16th century, religion wars in France, and also the rise of the Habsburg family. I'm going to tell you about that in a minute. That contributed to outshine France and make it lose the top spot for a very long period of time. In particular, in the 16th century, the most powerful European power was Spain with the Habsburg dynasty. The Habsburgs are a family that ruled Austria for centuries, and thanks to a policy of weddings that permitted to inherit territories, it managed to unify under the same king, Charles V, very large territories, the territories of Austria, but also the Kingdom of Spain, the south of Italy, the Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Burgundy, and the Duchy of Burgundy was important. There was a part of present-day France, but also Belgium and a good part of the Netherlands today. And in addition, Spain had started to explore the Americas and even Asia in the 16th century, and was building a fastly growing colonial empire throughout the world. And all of this made of Spain, and more generally the Habsburg family, the leading power in Europe in the 16th century. But by the beginning of the 17th century, the predominance of the Habsburgs started to decline for various reasons, because the territories controlled by Charles V were so large that they had been shared between two branches of the family. Also because the Netherlands started to revolt and were fighting for their independence that they would finally obtain in a few decades of war against Spain. Also because the flow of precious metals coming from the Americas had started to decrease, and because Spain was economically and militarily exhausted by a long period of constant wars in the Mediterranean Sea against the Turks, against France too, in the Spanish Netherlands, against England, the disaster of the Spanish Armada happened by the end of the 16th century, and all the conditions were now in place by the middle of the 17th century for France to claim again this status of leading great power in Europe. And actually, despite these internal troubles with the nobility that I mentioned earlier, Louis XIV inherited a kingdom in relatively good shape, full of promises, with by far the largest population in Europe. It is estimated that in the 17th century, France had a population of over 25 million inhabitants, which was more than all its neighbors combined, and this came from the relatively large territory controlled by France, and also a favorable climate that made it possible to sustain such a large population for this period. And it is this war machine that Louis XIV is going to use during his very long reign. He became king technically in 1643 when he was only 4 years old, and he died in 1715, so that's a reign of more than 60 years, during which France is going to enlarge its territory and be at the center of the European diplomatic stage. So for a king that claimed to be the most powerful in the world, at least in Europe, but for the Europeans in this period, Europe meant the world. It was normal or considered logical to have the largest and most impressive castle in Europe. Versailles was also a way to materialize this extraordinary power and influence that the French king was claiming for himself, and was also a diplomatic tool made to impress ambassadors, to clearly show the superiority of the Kingdom of France over any of its neighbors. Actually, this dominance in Europe would be a reality only for a few decades, because already by the last years of Louis XIV rule, things would be rebalanced in Europe. His first wars against Spain and the Dutch would be clear victories, but the last wars of his reign, like the War of the League of Augsburg or the War of the Spanish Succession, would be much less conclusive, and finally a balance of power appeared in the 18th century between various great powers like the UK, France, Austria, to a lesser extent Prussia. But after Louis XIV, that started to be called the Sun King after his first victories, Versailles would remain the place where the French kings, his successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, the King of France when the revolution happened, would leave and the court would stay. Now let's talk a bit about the castle itself and life in Versailles. First, given that the Sun King saw Versailles as the symbol of his power, he organized life in this royal residence like almost like a stage where the nobles and people visiting the King of France could see the show of power. So he created an extremely strict etiquette that any courtier had to respect, and this etiquette included the ritualization of the king's life in a fashion that looks almost absurd to us today. But the entire life of the Sun King was organized like a show. When he woke up in the morning, when he got dressed, courtiers that had received the privilege to participate in this ritual were giving him his clothes, were opening the doors, naming the nobles allowed to observe the king's life. Most of his lunches too were public, and you could see the king eating almost on a stage in front of an assembly of nobles who could come and go during his meals. The king was represented everywhere, including in the decoration of several rooms in the castle. He personally participated in shows that were organized to entertain the court, dancing or acting in front of the courtiers. And this strategy of turning royal power into a show worked extremely well with the nobility. The most prestigious noble families of France became obsessed with the status they occupied at the court, even though the living conditions in Versailles were far from ideal for them. Actually, the royal family had quite impressive and large apartments that were all opened to the public because, as I said, the life of the king had to be a permanent show for the visitors. But all the courtiers had to live in more than 300 apartments in the castle, sometimes small apartments with only 1 or 2 rooms, and the space available for the courtiers was sometimes so limited that they had to buy a house near the castle. And this is how the modern city of Versailles started to grow around the castle, where they could sleep, and they would use their apartment in Versailles only for their representation there, to receive people in these sometimes very small spaces available. Versailles was also an extremely contrasted place. It may give us the impression that it was extremely magnificent and fancy today, but in reality there was also the hidden part of the castle as soon as you get out of the rooms made for the reception and made to impress people, there is an absence of decoration. Until the reign of Louis XV in the 18th century, there were no bathrooms either, so I let you imagine the consequences. An army of servants, of maids, had to constantly clean the castle, and it is in this totally surreal atmosphere that for more than a century the French court would live until the French Revolution. The building of the castle itself took more than 40 years. As I said earlier, there was nothing in Versailles almost when Louis XIV decided to build it, just a hunting lodge built by his father, Louis XIII, because he liked to come to the domain of Versailles for hunting. And instead of destroying this lodge, Louis XIV ordered the building of an envelope around it, which made the core of the castle and added wings and more buildings around in the following decades as the castle continued to grow. 40 years of building and an impressive cost, because for more than 40 years the works in Versailles absorbed more than 10% of the national budget. This is totally unthinkable on modern standards. The gardens too received a lot of attention. They were designed by the most famous artists of the time, and the gardens are gigantic. They are considered the best example of so-called French gardens. In classical garden making, there are two main styles of gardens. The French ones, which are very symmetrical and generally look better seen from the upside, and you have the English gardens that appeared in the 18th century and that proved quite popular in France too in this period. So parts of the park in Versailles have been remade to adapt them to this new taste, which are completely different. They try to imitate nature by creating good-looking artificial landscapes. After the reign of Louis XIV, the etiquette in Versailles was loosened a bit by his successor, Louis XV. For example, the ritualization of the king's everyday life was strongly reduced, and he claimed the right for himself to live in private apartments, and this would continue with the following king, Louis XVI. But however, the etiquette in Versailles remained extremely strict, and this etiquette that was extremely difficult to stand for newcomers, especially the queens of France, traditionally coming from foreign countries, because these royal weddings were generally made to ensure the peace between countries or to reinforce an alliance. And that was the case of Queen Marie-Antoinette, the wife of Louis XVI, She was of Austrian origin, and the wedding of Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette was organized to seal the alliance between France and Austria by the middle of the 18th century. And she had a very hard time adjusting to the French etiquette, much stricter than the one she had lived with in Vienna. But one thing that would never change during this period of more than a century, when the court lived in Versailles, was the constant entertainment of the courtiers with parties, with operas, with plays presented almost on a daily basis to entertain people and ensure that the French court would remain the most brilliant in the known world. It would be an exaggeration to say that Versailles was one of the causes of the French Revolution, but in a sense it contributed to it by worsening the financial situation of the state because of the massive cost of this castle, and also because this display of luxury and fanciness in a country where by the end of the 18th century people were starving was unbearable for the population and contributed to the revolt. After the reign of Louis XIV, the appearance of Versailles as we know it today did not change that much. New buildings were added. For example, his successor, Louis XV, built the opera, and during the reign of Louis XVI, a little village was built to entertain Marie-Antoinette, the queen. It can be visited in the park today. And what makes Versailles testimony of the taste of the late 17th and 18th centuries is that after the French Revolution in 1789, the castle would not be occupied anymore, and actually shortly after the storming of the Bastille in 1789, the court, or what remained of it, essentially a small circle around the royal family, was forced to move to Paris, and Versailles would never be used again as the residence of the kings after the revolution, given the symbol that it represented. Napoleon, during a short period of time, lived close to the castle, but not in the castle itself. He recreated a new court and lived in the Grand Trianon, a smaller castle built in the park of Versailles. 20 years after the fall of Napoleon, the castle of Versailles was turned into a national museum, and it has been a museum opened to the public since then, with periods of interruption. The castle served again in the 19th and 20th centuries for the signing of treaties or proclamations. For example, in 1871, after the collapse of the French Second Empire, it is in the castle of Versailles that the Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, foundation of the German Empire. It is also in Versailles that in 1919 the Treaty of Versailles formalized the victory of the Allies against the Central Powers and organized the frontiers of Germany following its defeat in the First World War. And today, Versailles is one of the most visited tourist destinations in France and one of the symbols of the history of this country. As always, I hope you found this relaxing and maybe you learned a couple of things. I hope to see you soon for another topic, and as usual, your suggestions and requests are welcome in the comments below. Thank you and bye bye.